At 83, Barbra Streisand finally opens the vault of her heart. Not about awards, not about headlines, but about the 6 voices that built her own. From vaudeville audacity to velvet restraint, these singers weren't just influences, they were her inheritance. This isn't tribute, it's confession. The moment of reckoning. Why Barbra speaks now. Barbra Streisand has never been one to talk lightly. At 83, her words carry the weight of survival, of defiance, of artistry sharpened across 6 decades of scrutiny and standing ovations. So, when she finally spoke, not about fame, not about politics, not about legacy, but about love, the world listened. Not romantic love, not the kind printed in tabloids, but the kind that happens in song, the kind that happens when one voice collides with another and something inside of you shifts. I've kept these names to myself for a long time, she confessed. They weren't just influences, they were pieces of me. This wasn't perfunctory praise. She wasn't ticking names off a list of greatest singers. It was closer to confession, soulful, heavy, raw. Each name she revealed was part of her private architecture, bricks stacked quietly behind the spotlight, building the foundation of the voice that carried her through Broadway, through film, through history itself. She spoke their names softly, carefully, like prayers. And with each one came a story, a scar, or a memory. These weren't just artists she admired. They were the invisible chorus that shaped her own sound, the ghosts who sang through her breath. For Streisand, naming them now, after decades of silence, felt like a reckoning. Why wait until 83? She answered without hesitation, because gratitude is useless when it's unspoken. Time had pressed down on her shoulders, the kind of time that narrows your circle and sharpens your truths. She had outlived so many peers. She had carried their echoes with her for decades. And finally, she knew the moment had come, not to write history, but to give thanks. The voice is a fragile thing, she said, her own trembling slightly. It dies with you. But the people who gave me mine, they deserve to live forever. So she opened the vault, she named the names. First among them, the one who wasn't just an influence, but a mirror from another age, Fanny Brice, the vaudeville spirit who kicked down the door before Barbra ever dared to walk through it. Fanny Brice, the vaudeville spirit that kicked down the door. If Barbra Streisand ever had a ghostly twin, it was Fanny Brice. Before Barbra became Barbra, before the wigs and gowns and film roles, there was Fanny, a Jewish comedienne with a crooked smile, a razor wit, and a voice that made audiences weep one minute and roar the next. She didn't just sing, Barbra said, she exploded. Brice was audacious at a time when women weren't supposed to be. She wasn't pretty in the conventional sense, and she never tried to be. Instead, she made her quirks her crown, her flaws her spotlight. And when young Barbra stumbled upon Brice's recordings, she saw herself reflected. Fanny gave me permission, Barbra whispered. Permission to be bold, to be different, to be unforgettable. When Broadway first noticed Streisand, the comparisons were inevitable. The accent, the comic timing, the way she could twist heartbreak into humor. Some said she was imitating Brice, but Barbra always saw it differently. I wasn't copying her, I was conversing with her. Years later, when she embodied Brice on screen in Funny Girl, it wasn't just an acting role, it was communion. She taught me how to laugh at myself, Streisand said, and how to turn that laughter into survival. Off stage, Barbra often wondered how Brice must have felt. Being ahead of her time, misunderstood, underestimated, then suddenly irreplaceable. That too, Barbra knew intimately. She showed me the path wasn't smooth, Barbra admitted, but she also showed me the path was mine. What mattered most wasn't Brice's jokes or her big numbers. It was her audacity. She turned her difference into dominance. She dared the world to look away, and it never did. Barbra carried that same spirit every time she stepped on stage, defying critics who wanted her softer, prettier, quieter. Instead, she belted, she joked, she shimmered with the same untamed force Brice once had. Without Fanny, Barbra concluded, there wouldn't have been me. And with that, she moved on, from the vaudeville spirit who opened the door for her to a Parisian storm whose pain and passion would break her heart wide open. The next name, Edith Piaf. Edith Piaf, the raw passion that broke her heart. For Barbra Streisand, Edith Piaf was more than a singer. She was a storm that refused to die. Barbra first encountered Piaf's voice as a teenager, playing records alone in her Brooklyn bedroom. The sound that poured out wasn't polished, wasn't perfect. It was jagged, trembling, drenched in sorrow, but it cut through her like nothing else. I had never heard such honesty, Barbra confessed. She didn't just sing a song, she bled it. That rawness would become Barbra's compass. While other singers were chasing prettiness, Piaf gave the world ugliness turned beautiful. Her cracked edges, her desperate highs, her whispered lows, they weren't flaws. They were the evidence of a life lived hard, a heart beaten thin, but still fighting. Barbra remembers the first time she saw a Piaf performance on film. It wasn't a concert, she said. It was a confession. Piaf stood barely 5 feet tall, but her shadow towered across the stage, swallowing the room whole. Each lyric landed like a blade. Each cry seemed ripped from her marrow. She was a force of nature, Barbra said, her voice almost breaking. You couldn't hide from her. You couldn't escape her. Streisand carried Piaf's lesson into her own performances. That vulnerability isn't weakness, it's power. When critics said she was too emotional, too theatrical, too much, she thought of Piaf. When they said her voice was unusual, unfashionable, too brash, she thought of Piaf. Edith taught me that being too much is exactly what makes you unforgettable, she admitted. Barbra even confessed that Piaf broke her heart. Because in Piaf, she saw what fame could destroy. Love affairs turned tragic, nights consumed by loneliness, applause that couldn't fill the silence at home. She lived like a wound, Barbra said softly, and sometimes I feared I was walking the same road. But perhaps the greatest gift Piaf gave her wasn't sorrow, it was survival. Piaf sang as if every performance might be her last, as if her life depended on it. And in a way, it did. Barbra absorbed that urgency, that defiance. She learned to treat every note not as decoration, but as lifeblood. Authenticity above all. In her tremor, I found myself, Barbra said, because it told me, don't run from the pain, sing it. And as the memory of Piaf's haunting voice echoed, Barbra shifted to a name closer to home, not storm, but seduction. Not jagged edges, but velvet smoothness. The man who taught her restraint, timing, and the art of whispering to a room, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, the subtle seducer of soul. If Edith Piaf taught Barbra the power of breaking, Frank Sinatra taught her the power of holding back. He could seduce a room with one whisper, she said, almost smiling. Unlike Piaf's wild abandon, Sinatra's strength was his restraint. He didn't force the song, he leaned into it. He knew the art of phrasing so well, he could turn a pause into poetry. Barbra, young and hungry to master her own instrument, studied him obsessively, not for the size of his notes, but for the space around them. He taught me that less can be more, she said, that silence can sing louder than sound. She recalls sitting with a record of Sinatra's ballads, rewinding a single bar again and again. It wasn't the note that caught her. It was the way he let the air linger just long enough to make your chest tighten. He made you wait for it, she explained, and then when it came, it felt like he was singing only to you. It was a lesson in intimacy, in seduction without spectacle. Sinatra didn't need fireworks, he could break your heart with a sigh. Barbra once attended one of his live shows, long before she was a star. She sat in the cheap seats, her hands clasped in awe. What struck her wasn't the voice, though flawless, it was his command of time. He bent tempo to his will, stretching it like taffy, snapping it back with a sly grin. Every breath of his was a masterclass, she said. Years later, when Barbra herself was being studied for her powerful belting and theatricality, she admitted that Sinatra's influence lived quietly in her phrasing. Beneath the grandeur, there was his subtle seduction. He was the first to show me that performance is not about volume, it's about connection, she said. They eventually met, briefly, at an industry event. Sinatra raised a glass and told her, "Kid, you've got guts." It wasn't flowery praise, but it was everything. That was enough, she said with a smile, because from him, less always meant more. And so, from Piaf's storm and Sinatra's whisper, Barbra learned two truths of music. "You must be willing to bleed, and you must be willing to breathe." Her journey through voices moved next to someone far less famous, but perhaps just as transformative. Laura Nyro, the breezy soul who carried her away. Laura Nyro, the breezy soul that carried her away. If Fanny Brice gave Barbra audacity and Piaf gave her pain, Laura Nyro gave her freedom. She wasn't a superstar in the mold of Sinatra or Piaf. She was quieter, elusive, an artist's artist. But when Barbra first heard Nyro's music in the late 1960s, something in her chest loosened. It was like hearing the breeze sing, she remembered. Nyro blended jazz, pop, gospel, folk, genres that weren't supposed to belong together. Yet, in her hands, they fused effortlessly, like streams flowing into one river. Barbra, who had already faced criticism for not fitting neatly into categories herself, felt an immediate kinship. She didn't ask permission, Barbra said. She just sang what she felt. No apology, no explanation. What captivated Streisand most was the intimacy of Nyro's voice. It wasn't polished like Mathis or regal like Horn. It was vulnerable, imperfect, and in that imperfection lived truth. She taught me that you don't have to sing perfectly to sing honestly, Barbra admitted. In 1971, Streisand recorded an entire album of Nyro's songs, Stony End. It was a departure from her typical theatrical ballads, a leap into something looser, more confessional. Some critics were puzzled. Barbra didn't care. "Laura gave me permission to exhale," she said. The lyrics Nyro wrote, about heartbreak, about longing, about fleeting joy, allowed Barbra to step away from the grandeur of show tunes and inhabit something simpler, something raw. She showed me that bending a note, sliding off pitch, whispering instead of belting, it can all be music if it's honest. Barbra often referred to Nyro's songwriting as poetry in motion, lines that drifted like smoke, melodies that curled around your heart instead of hitting you head on. Her songs carried me away, she confessed, and sometimes they carried me back to myself. Nyro never achieved the fame her talent deserved. She was too idiosyncratic, too pure, too unwilling to compromise. But that too was part of her lesson to Barbra. Authenticity matters more than applause. She reminded me that it's not about how many people listen, Barbra said. It's about how deeply they feel when they do. To this day, when Barbra sings her softer, quieter numbers, there's a trace of Nyro's breeze lingering in her phrasing, a breath of freedom, a whisper of rebellion. And then, as her voice steadied, Barbra smiled, because after Nyro's gentle liberation, she remembered the name of a man who gave her something just as valuable, not freedom, but grace. His name, Johnny Mathis. Johnny Mathis, the gentleman who lifted her voice. For Barbra Streisand, Johnny Mathis was the voice of elegance, the voice she listened to late at night when she wanted to remember what beauty sounded like. "I adored him," she admitted. "Before I ever met him, I adored him." Mathis's recordings filled Barbra's early years in Brooklyn. His phrasing was smooth, his tone like silk brushed against glass. Where Piaf cracked and Brice exploded, Mathis glided. He sang as though no note could ever hurt him. There was calm in his voice, Barbra said, a kind of stillness I longed for. As her own career skyrocketed, she carried Mathis with her, quietly, as a standard of elegance over excess. She admired how he resisted showy tricks. He didn't belt to prove a point. He didn't push to prove power. He let the song carry him, and in doing so, lifted everyone who listened. Decades later, her admiration turned into reality when she finally got to sing with him. The occasion was a performance of West Side Story medleys. Two voices intertwined, Barbra's dramatic, expansive tones folding into Mathis's velvet smoothness. It was like Holy Communion, Barbra said, smiling. Two voices I had carried in my heart, finally meeting out loud. She described the duet as one of the most profound musical moments of her life, not because of the applause, but because of the kindness in his sound. Singing beside him felt less like a competition and more like being held. Johnny reminded me that glitz is nothing without grace, she said. And grace, for Barbra, became the unshakable core of her performances. Even when she dazzled in sequins, even when she soared to impossible notes, she carried Mathis's quiet reminder that sometimes the most moving thing a singer can give is not volume, but ease. She called him the gentleman who lifted my voice, because in his presence, on record and finally on stage, she felt lighter, softer, elevated. And when she remembers him now, she remembers more than just the songs. She remembers the feeling of being young, dreaming in Brooklyn, listening to a voice that made the world seem kinder. Johnny was elegance itself, she whispered, and I wanted some of that elegance to live in me. From Mathis's Velvet Grace, Barbra's thoughts moved to another influence, not one she shouted about, but one that lingered quietly in her phrasing, shaping her from the shadows. A voice she didn't always name directly, but whose presence she could never deny, Lena Horne's echo. Lena Horne's echo, the quiet revolution within. Not every influence announces itself with fanfare. Some arrive quietly, like a shadow that follows you, even when you pretend not to notice. For Barbra Streisand, Lena Horne was exactly that kind of presence. Barbra didn't often list Horne among her official influences. Maybe it was humility, maybe reverence. But deep down, she knew Horne's phrasing, her restraint, her sophistication had quietly shaped her own voice. She was always there, Barbra said softly, even when I didn't say her name. Horne was more than a singer. She was a symbol, a black woman in mid-century America, breaking barriers on stage and screen while fighting a world eager to silence her. She carried herself with elegance, but beneath that elegance burned steel. Barbra, a Jewish girl from Brooklyn who knew what it meant to be underestimated, recognized the courage immediately. She never raised her voice to prove her worth, Barbra reflected. She proved it by standing still, by being undeniable. Barbra first heard Lena Horne on records her mother played. Those long vowels, those velvet tones that curved like smoke in a nightclub. Barbra absorbed them before she ever realized they were seeping into her. Later, when she studied her own phrasing, she caught echoes of Horne in the way she lingered on a word, in the patience of her pauses. I always heard the shadow of her in me, Barbra admitted. But Horne's influence wasn't only vocal, it was emotional, political. Horne turned her art into quiet revolution, refusing roles that demeaned her, demanding dignity at every turn. That stance resonated with Streisand, who herself faced an industry eager to reshape her nose, her look, her sound into something acceptable. Horne showed me that dignity isn't negotiable, Barbra said, and that sometimes the most radical act is restraint. When Barbra finally met Lena Horne later in life, the encounter was brief but unforgettable. Horne, regal even in her 70s, greeted her with warmth but also with a kind of recognition. Two women who had carried themselves through hostile terrain without compromise. She didn't have to tell me what she gave me, Barbra said. I already knew. Horne's echo remains in Streisand's music like a hidden harmony, not always named, not always obvious, but always there, carrying her through every note that demands sophistication, control, and quiet fire. She reminded me, Barbra said, that sometimes the softest voice is the one that lasts the longest. And from that quiet revolution, Streisand turned her thoughts to the greater pattern, the way all these voices, Bryce, Piaf, Sinatra, Nairo, Mathis, Horne, wove themselves into her life, into her lungs, into her legend. That pattern, she said, was the thread that bound them all. The thread that binds them. When Barbra Streisand finally set down the 6 names, her hands trembled slightly. Not because the act was difficult, but because it was final. A summoning of ghosts, a confession long delayed. These singers weren't just voices I admired, she said. They were my compass. Each one gave her something essential. Fanny Brice gave her audacity. Edith Piaf gave her sorrow. Frank Sinatra gave her restraint. Laura Nyro gave her freedom. Johnny Mathis gave her elegance. Lena Horne gave her poise. Alone, they were extraordinary. Together they formed the invisible scaffolding of Barbra's own artistry. I don't just hear them in my music, she confessed. I hear them in my breath, in my phrasing, in the silences between notes. They live in me. The thread binding them wasn't genre or fame, it was truth. Each of them had the courage to sing who they were, not who the world wanted them to be. That, Barbra realized, was the lesson she carried most fiercely. They didn't sing to be loved, she said. They sang to be real, and that is why we still love them. When she reflects on her own voice, she doesn't hear it as a singular miracle. She hears it as a chorus, stitched together by those who came before her. "I've never believed in the idea of a self-made artist," she explained. "We are all mosaics. Every song I sing is their gift passed through me." That acknowledgement, at 83, wasn't just tribute, it was legacy setting. By naming them, she wasn't only thanking them, she was passing them forward, casting a lifeline to future artists who might stumble upon these names, these voices, and find the same kind of permission, survival, and freedom she once did. She paused, then added, "They weren't my influences, they were my inheritance." And with that, she closed the circle. From vaudeville laughter to Parisian heartbreak, from Sinatra's Hush to Nairo's Breeze, from Mathis's Velvet to Horn's Dignity, Barbra Streisand carried them all. Their thread became her tapestry, their legacy, her voice. "They live every time I sing," she whispered, "and that is how I love them still." The unspoken names, lost loves and quiet heroes. When Barbra Streisand finished naming the 6 singers she loved most, the room held its breath, but then, with a slight smile, she admitted something else. There were others. Names she never said out loud. Voices she never officially listed. Influences so private, they felt more like secrets than tributes. "There are some voices that don't belong to the public," she said softly. "They belong only to me." These weren't necessarily the icons everyone knew. Some were forgotten nightclub singers she'd seen in the smoky corners of Manhattan, women who sang for 50 people and poured their whole lives into those songs. Some were teachers, mentors who coaxed her voice out of its raw beginnings, urging her to stop imitating others and dare to sound like herself. And some were fleeting collaborators, duet partners for a single evening, accompanists whose chords still echoed in her memory decades later. "I never said their names because they weren't famous," Barbra confessed, "but they're in me. Every time I hold a note, they're there." And then there were the more painful silences, the singers who carried too much weight to be spoken of, rivalries that cut too close, artists whose lives ended tragically, their stories too heavy for her to revisit. "Some names are just too sad," she admitted, "too personal. Saying them feels like reopening a wound." But those voices live on in her music in different ways, in the way she shapes a word, in the pauses between her phrases, in the ache that sometimes sneaks into her brightest songs. "They exist in the echoes," she said. What mattered to Barbra was not whether the world ever knew them. What mattered was that she carried them, every singer, every ghost, every forgotten note, inside her voice. And that, she believed, was the truest way of honoring them. "You can write a name on a program," she reflected, "but the real tribute is to let them breathe through you." It was this blend of the spoken and unspoken, the famous and forgotten, that gave Streisand her unique sound. She was never one voice. She was a chorus, stitched together by love, loss, memory, and music. "They made me," she said simply. "The ones I named, the ones I didn't. All of them." And as her eyes grew distant, it was clear. Naming these 6 singers was not just looking back. It was setting something in motion. A torch, passed from the past to the future. Legacy of love, passing the torch. At 83, Barbra Streisand knew she was not just remembering, she was leaving something behind. Speaking these names, Fanny Brice, Edith Piaf, Frank Sinatra, Laura Nyro, Johnny Mathis, Lena Horne, was more than tribute. It was a roadmap, a lifeline cast out to future singers who might wonder where to turn when their voice feels too different, too fragile, too misunderstood. "This isn't just my story," Barbra said. "It's theirs, and it's yours." She hoped that young artists wouldn't only study her recordings, her performances, her legend, but would go back, listen to the voices she carried, learn the lessons they gave her, that boldness matters, that sorrow can be strength, that restraint can be louder than volume, that imperfection can be poetry, that elegance can heal, that dignity is non-negotiable. "Love the ones who shaped you," she urged, "and linger on their lines." This was not just advice, it was farewell, a reminder that her own career, no matter how monumental, was not built in isolation. It was built in the echoes of others. "To sing is to remember," she said, "and to remember is to live on." For Streisand, the 6 names were not a ranking. They were not a list. They were a final act of gratitude, spoken while there was still time, spoken so that the next generation would not just hear her, but hear them through her. "They are the reason my voice exists the way it does," she admitted, "and I want the world to know that before I go." And with that, her legacy was clear. Not just the woman who sang louder, higher, longer than anyone else, but the woman who never forgot where her own song began. As the camera faded, her last words lingered. "They live in me, and now they can live in you too." They gave her audacity, sorrow, elegance, and grace. At 83, Barbra Streisand names them at last. Bryce, Piaf, Sinatra, Nairo, Mathis, Horn. They live inside her voice, echoing in every note she sings. Her final message: to sing is to remember, and to remember is to live forever.